Muito boa tarde a todos os que nos seguem nas redes sociais. Bem-vindos à Biblioteca Municipal Eduardo Lourenço para a terceira conferência deste ciclo de conferências internacionais à Europa dos Escritores, que o município da Guarda, sobre a chancela da candidatura da Guarda à Capital Europeia da Cultura, com a coordenação científica do Dr. Jorge Maximino, apresentamos, por isso, ao longo de um ano, um conjunto de conferências com convidados de várias geografias e convidados com a mais vasta experiência científica, literária, para refletir sobre as questões contemporâneas, sobre a reflexão de perspectivas relacionadas com a literatura, sobretudo abordando temas da história das cidades, a história e as culturas das cidades que naturalmente todos nos preocupam, num tempo em que se assiste cada vez mais a uma amnésia geracional relativamente a muitas das nossas dimensões como civilização. Estas conferências cumprem um papel fundamental, muito importante, a partir da cidade mais alta, nessa reflexão plural, aberta, dialogante, com os convidados que o Dr. Jorge Maximino trouxe a este espaço a partir da cidade da Guarda, numa reflexão seguramente importante entre aquilo que é a construção das identidades e a salvaguarda da memória cultural. E por isso, em nome do município da Guarda, dou as boas-vindas a todos, agradecer mais uma vez ao Dr. Jorge Maximino o seu trabalho nesta proposta que se tem consolidado como uma proposta importante de reflexão no nosso mundo contemporâneo e desejar naturalmente que esta conferência, protagonizada por Marco FAZZINI, que cumprimento desde já e agradeço em nome do município da Guarda o facto de ter aceito este convite e desejar naturalmente que esta conferência, esta reflexão, seja mais uma vez, num conjunto de todas as outras que já aconteceram, seguramente um marco importante de reflexão sobre o nosso mundo atual. Por isso, Dr. Jorge Maximino, muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Muito boa tarde a todos. Obrigado por estarem connosco mais uma vez. É um prazer para nós aqui hoje na Biblioteca Eduardo Lourenço mais uma vez darmos aqui sequência ao ciclo de conferências da Europa dos Escritores, que começou em junho passado. Este ano, como de certo modo no ano passado, um pouco alterado nas suas datas, em virtude ainda do contexto de pandemia que ainda estamos a viver, queria agradecer também ao nosso convidado de hoje, Marco FAZZINI, primeiro por se ter disponibilizado a colaborar neste ciclo com uma conferência e também por se ter tornado um amigo desta biblioteca, uma vez que é a segunda participação que ele dá aqui para estas atividades da Biblioteca Eduardo Lourenço, depois de uma participação com leituras de poesia há precisamente 3 anos. Agora disponibilizou-se para esta conferência que vai ter lugar hoje. Queremos explicar antes de mais o seguinte: esta conferência, tendo em conta que tem havido algumas videoconferências, como é o caso desta hoje, que não funcionaram muito bem porque houve falhas informáticas, falhas na internet e propuseram-nos os técnicos que a melhor solução seria, efetivamente, em vez de uma intervenção em direto, o nosso convidado de hoje gravar a sua conferência. Foi o que fizemos, portanto, os nossos convidados, o público que nos está a seguir, vai assistir a essa conferência gravada e logo de seguida teremos o conferencista em direto connosco para responder às perguntas que eventualmente sejam colocadas. Espero que assim todos beneficiem melhor, muito mais, desta conferência que, sendo apresentada em língua inglesa, tem a sua tradução, que para o caso será apresentada em legendagem junto à imagem do conferencista. Queria aproveitar só para dizer 2 palavras sobre Marco FAZZINI, muito resumidamente. A nota biográfica circula na agenda da Biblioteca Municipal Eduardo Lourenço, também está acessível pela via online. Marco FAZZINI é poeta, é escritor e é investigador e professor na Universidade Ca' Foscari da cidade de Veneza. E é investigador da área das literaturas de língua inglesa e especialmente da época pós-colonial. É também diretor artístico de um festival de poesia, um dos mais importantes da Itália, que é o Festival de Poesia e Música de Vicenza, da cidade de Vicenza. Vai apresentar-nos uma conferência cujo título é SEAMUS, HEANEY e a Poesia Escocesa. Portanto, o objetivo aqui, o objetivo principal é estabelecer relações entre a obra deste grande poeta, que se tornou também Prémio Nobel, como sabem, e a poesia escocesa, mas também as relações culturais entre as suas atividades e até as relações pessoais com outros poetas da Escócia. Desejo a todos uma boa conferência e até depois desta gravação a que vão assistir. Obrigado.
To everyone, thank you for coming. This will be a talk on Maximino and his Scottish friends and influences. I first came across Maximino's name when I was doing research on the English poet Geoffrey Hill for my degree dissertation at the University of Venice in the middle 80s. Only a few articles on Geoffrey Hill had been published at that time, and one of them was by Maximino. So while working on a great English poet, I discovered a great Irish poet. His collection called Preoccupations, Selected Prose, 68-78, showed me what a refined and deep reader of other poets such as Wordsworth, Yeats, Hopkins, MacDiarmid, Larkin, Hughes, Geoffrey Hill himself, and Patrick Kavanagh, HEANEY could be. Together with his other prose books, such as The Government of the Town and Finders Keepers, his first collection of essays demonstrated his versatility and broad range of interest. Summarizing the intentions and achievements of HEANEY's extensive cultural contribution to literary criticism and teaching occupation is both difficult and daunting. That is, the HEANEY who was fascinated by Brodsky, Mioch and Herbert, as well as the classicist HEANEY, a companion to Sophocles, Dante and Virgil. HEANEY, the translator of Anglo-Saxon and Scots poets, of the Irish legend of Sweeney, and also the translator of Leon Janacek. HEANEY, the teacher, he started at Queen's University of Belfast, then he taught at Carrisford College, and later on at Harvard University. But there is also the HEANEY was the poet who refused both in nationality and language when he protested through his book An Open Letter, refusing to appear in a famous anthology of British poetry. He wrote, "Be advised, my passport's green, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen." My fascination with HEANEY's poem and poetry was immediate. I was so attracted to his bog improvisations that I translated some of them, and for the first time, into Italian. My translations were published in '89, soon after my experience with my dissertation on Geoffrey Hill. Those book poems were published in one of the leading literary journals of the time, now defunct, called Origine. It was at that time, and mainly because of those translations, that HEANEY and I began exchanging letters and messages. The first letter was dated the 15th of September 1989. HEANEY, he wrote, appreciated the journal I sent him and was honored despite his, as he put it, minute knowledge of Italian. Having a look now at all the papers we exchanged, I realized that more than 30 years have elapsed, and that a folder has been filled with HEANEY's letters, cards, postcards, faxes, slim pamphlets, books, manuscripts, and greeting cards for Christmas, usually with a fragment of a poem, a quotation, or a phrase. I remember I was particularly moved by a 1997 pamphlet called Would They Had Stayed, which included a poem dedicated to 3 great poets from Scotland that I knew well and who all died in 1996, Norman MacCaig, Solly MacLean, and George Mackay-Brown. For HEANEY, like for everyone interested in contemporary Scottish poetry and literature, it was a very great loss. His indebtedness to 20th century Scottish poetry was evident from the very beginning of his poetic career. HEANEY himself pointed to the early influences he felt had shaped him and his style, particularly with reference to Hugh MacDiarmid, Norman MacCaig himself, and perhaps the late medieval poet Robert Harrison, and also the 2 Gaelic poets Solly MacLean and Ian Crichton-Smith. In this brief talk, I would like to investigate his concern with them, especially with respect to his own critical accounts and poetic practice. So I'm referring especially to Solly MacLean, Hugh MacDiarmid, and Norman MacCaig. I remember that in 1993, after translating several of Norman MacCaig's poems, I had a chat with Maximino in Bologna, and it was after he had launched the Italian translation of his volume Station Island. One of HEANEY's images seems particularly relevant to me. His use of the fisherman's line under the surface of the water hints at the obliqueness of his own technique of in-depth excavation, when it becomes a tool to probe hidden and internal feelings and dreams, either hauled up from the unconscious or taken from history. And history for HEANEY often means the history of a language or languages, even those lost and forgotten. This is the strategy that he shared with MacCaig, bridging Irish and Scottish traumas and desires. As he himself put it in his essay, "One day, at a party in Edinburgh, in a room full of smoke and music and flirtation, Norman took me into a corner and began to whistle a totally bewitching air. It was a fragment of a pibroch, a few orphaned phrases as piercing as Carlyle Cole, but it was also a melody of the soul's loneliness, a tune that was like a piece of secret knowledge. This filament of sound that unspooled from his lips that day was an Ariadne's thread leading in to the heart of the Scottish Gaelic maze. In there, at the outback of modernity and English, there dwells the fatal shape of defeat and dispersal, language lost and trauma. Obviously, Norman MacCaig was a musician, he played violin, and he was one of the best friends of Ali Bain, one of the great protagonists of folk music in Scotland. So when the Italian book L'Equilibrista was finally published in 1995, summer of 1995, Heaney, despite a bad cold, wanted to fly to Edinburgh and launch the book together with Norman MacCaig himself, Valerie Gillis, and myself. And many intellectuals, poets and writers were in the audience at the National Library in Edinburgh, including Robert Crawford, Christopher White, Tessa Ransford, Patrick Crotty, and MacCaig was frail in those days and unstable due to illness, yet he enjoyed the reading and cherished his friends. Some weeks earlier, Heaney had asked me not to show his introduction to Norman MacCaig. Understandably, on the day of the launch, the Scottish poet was deeply moved. I sensed that Seamus Heaney was probably thinking that it was the very last time he would enjoy Norman's company. I imagine that Heaney's admiration for Norman MacCaig's poetry was mostly determined by Norman's accurate descriptions of the deceitful nature of language when describing the world, but also by the conflict between the English language and the Scottish native languages of Scotland, Scots and Gaelic in particular, a problem he could easily link to a similar situation in contemporary Ireland. The sense of a disappearing Gaelic society is always present in MacCaig's poetry. His country, he says, was haunted by bog trotters, moss troopers, fired ricks and roof trees in the black night, glinting on tossed horns and red blades. This is the violent starting point of an inevitable shrinking of Gaelic population and their heritage, an issue Heaney particularly associated with what happened in his home country, particularly and especially after the occupation of Ireland by the British troops. In North, one of his major collections, dated 1975, Heaney describes that violence as a real geographical, physical and linguistic rape against Ireland, a union ratified in 1801. He used the sonnet form to compose one of his most intriguing and passionate poems, Act of Union, in two parts, two sonnets. So I will read just the first section, which is one of the very strong poems about the troubles, the violence in Ireland. Tonight, a first movement, a pulse, as if the rain in bogland gathered had, to sleep and flood, a bog burst, a gash breaking open the ferny bed. Your back is a firm line of eastern coast, and arms and legs are thrown beyond your gradual hills. I caress the heaving province where our past has grown. I am the tall kingdom over your shoulder that you would neither cajole nor ignore. Conquest is a lie. I grow older, conceding your half-independent shore, within whose borders now my legacy culminates inexorably. Heaney's interest in the Scottish poetry produced by some of his best friends did not diminish through decades. He not only contributed on McCaig and later on McDermott, but wrote a strategic essay on Edwin Muir for my book Alba Literaria, A History of Scottish Literature, published in 2005. A piece of writing that passed through a seemingly unending series of corrections and drafts. These common friends were very much talked about when we met, be it in St. Andrews, Milan or Mantua. In one of our meetings in Dublin in 2008, while we were sipping coffee in his large home kitchen next to the Strand, Seamus and I discussed the demonstrations we had participated in the day before at Tara, where he gave a short speech and read a few poems, supporting a demonstration to save the archaeological site of Tara from the construction and the passing of a highway seemed an appropriate stand on Heaney's side back then, especially if it might help the survival of a place which had served as Ireland's political and spiritual capital up until the arrival of the Normans. Tara was the recognized seat of the kings of Ireland until the 6th century and a key site in Neolithic times. So you can see the map here on the photo. I would like to linger on for some more minutes on the content of one of our conversations, because I think it can really cast light on more than one issue here. In Dublin, we extensively talked of the English archaeological remains of Offa's kingdom that Heaney had read and appreciated in Geoffrey Hill's Merchant Hymns, one of the key books in British poetry. He himself had composed Stations a few months before, but the book was not published because Geoffrey Hill published his Merchant Hymns, which was actually a masterpiece. So Heaney considered his Stations as a minor publications as compared to the others. He also recalled the Bushman rock paintings during his visit to NELM, the National English Literary Museum in Grahamstown in South Africa, and he lectured at Rhodes University in South Africa in Grahamstown, where he read and lectured for a large audience made up of mainly of intellectuals and poets. So in those days he was accompanied on a special tour to a famous archaeological site and by, among others, one of our common friends, the South African poet Don McLennan of Scottish origins. This is quite interesting because Don McLennan himself, in his book called Rock Paintings at Salem, later on wrote, "My companions photograph the paintings. I envisage shiny prints that will show to relatives back home. But how can we enter this other world of blood-red figures freed by healing acts of which we are ignorant, by hands on back and chest that redirect or free the boiling energy? Dreaming and waking intermingle here confusedly." Heaney and myself also talked about other major figures in South African poetry, including Douglas Livingstone, also of Scottish origins, whom I had known well and whose work I had translated for various publications in Italy in the 90s. Livingstone was a microbiologist devoted much of his career as a writer to recovering some of his pre-colonial civilization of a forgotten time, when rock art hinted at the interlacing of animal and the human worlds in natural pre-verbal language of a sort. As Livingstone wrote in his poem Rock Art, times were pitiless, rough. The code has not changed much. The series ends with the beast trampling with its knees, tribesmen in the throes of worshipping this new god. This poem by Livingstone is quite important. Livingstone's image is particularly apt because he himself talks of a pre-verbal register of the poetic language when referring to MacDiarmid, one of his favorite companions, Olympians. Heaney's attention to an involvement in my translation of MacDiarmid's long poem on a raised beach was probably suggested by my effort to reproduce that pre-verbal register into Italian. As Heaney himself admitted, MacDiarmid had fascinated him since the very beginning of his poetic career, and he considered the Wolsey poet a far-out blethering genius. In his celebrated essay, A Torchlight Procession of One, the Irish poet paid further compliments and described MacDiarmid as the writer who prepared the ground for a Scottish literature that would be self-critical, experimental in relation to its own inherited forms and idioms, but one that would also be stimulated by developments elsewhere in world literature. Heaney actually met MacDiarmid for the first time in 1967 in the house of Kader Asmal, a professor of law at the Trinity College and an anti-apartheid activist, just before a poetry reading to celebrate the Human Rights Day. He met the Scottish poet again at his house in Biggar, in Lanarkshire, after having chatted about him with Patrick Crotty, who had written a PhD dissertation on MacDiarmid. It seems that other than the strength of the first 1922 short Scots lyrics and the 1926 long poem A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, what seriously attracted Heaney to MacDiarmid was the latter's strategic shift from symbolic Scots to synthetic English. And what was great about his effort in Scotland was the inclusiveness of it. In his poem, An Invocation, dedicated to MacDiarmid, Heaney calls his Scottish friend a catechism worth repeating always. So let's have a look at one of the sections of Heaney's poem called An Invocation for MacDiarmid. Incline to me, MacDiarmid, out of Shetland, stone-eyed from stone-gazing, sobered up and thrown. Not the old vigilante of the chimney corner, having us on, setting us off, the drinker's drinker. No, incline as the sage of wind that floods the rock face, as gulls tolled in the sea breeze, gatekeeper of open gates behind the brows of birds. On the dust jacket of Scottish scene, a work by MacDiarmid and Lewis Grassic Gibbon, published in 1934, last century, which was also the year of publication of MacDiarmid's long poem on Raised Beach. A map of Scotland is shown with some of Scotland's poets occupying the territories related through their works and their lives. McDermott himself stands upright on the island, on the map of the island of Wolseley in the Shetlands, his hands at his sides and slightly bent towards the southwest, surveys the Scottish scene while striking an inquisitive posture, probably making sure that the Scottish Renaissance is safely on course. HEANEY may have remembered the map and the long poem when apparently referring to McDermott's program for the reunification of Scotland and Ireland under the driving force of Gaelic. He wrote the following lines in the final section of his poem dedicated, his invocation dedicated to McDermott. So you can have a look at the map and listen to this final section of his poem. And if you won't incline, endure at an embraced distance. Be the wee, contrary stormcock that you always wear, the weather eye of a poetry like the weather, a shifting force, a factor entering whether it prevails or not, constantly tuned in of its time and place, and ours if we are lucky. Never, at any rate, beyond us, even when outlandish. In the accent, in the idiom, in the idea, like a thistle in the wind, a catechism worth repeating always. Many details included in HEANEY's poem refer to events, ideas, and achievements of some 70 years before, when McDermott, aged 41, composed one of the deepest and most stimulating poetic meditations of the last century on a raised beach. Laid low by a psychological and physical distress, McDermott arrived in Wolseley, Shetlands, hoping to regain energies and the will to write. His stay in Wolseley has in itself something of an act of self-preservation. HEANEY speaks of McDermott's survival that had to do with his getting down to the bedrock of his own resources, a bedrock which was reinforced at the time by contact with the stoical fishermen of the Shetland Islands and his at homeness in the bleakness of the actual geological conditions. So thanks to the friendships with various people in Wolseley, and especially of Thomas Robertson, the Scottish poet learned about the glaciation of the islands, the formation of rocks in that part of the world, and the West Linga raised beaches. The story that he spent 3 days on a beach without food, sleeping in a cave, has the air of myth about it. It's more likely that from his cottage in Sodom he enjoyed the view of the Linga Sound and beyond. McDermott's investigation is vertical. The ambition is to go as deep as possible into the essence of the physical world, to the very echeitas of the stones. This is done mainly through the experimental language, which reveals its numerous etymological strata and tries to preserve its oral origins, or, as HEANEY has it, a phonetic patterning which preceded speech and authenticated it, a kind of pre-verbal register to which the poetic voice had to be tuned. Incidentally, HEANEY is not always enchanted in his final evaluation of the long poem. On the one hand, he speaks of a fine excess, a unique, multitudinous accuracy and psychedelic richness. On the other hand, such poems as On Raised Beach totter close to the self-parody and only get by through the huge appetite the author displays for marching the multiplicity of the phenomena with a correspondingly cornucopic vocabulary. So, in short, what Heaney discovered in McCaig and McDermott, but also in the other two major contemporary Scottish poets, George Mackay Brown and Solly MacLean, was certainly a sense of strong identity rooted in place and dialect. Of the last, he observed that he has an epic poet's possession of ground, founders, heroes, battles, lovers, legends, all of them at once, part of his personal apparatus of feeling and part of the common but threatened ghost life of his language and culture. There is nothing antiquarian or archival about this drive. We need only compare the way the names of mountains, waters and woods animate his poetry with the way the names of places and characters are put to work in the writings of David Jones, in order to see how purely poetic, how non-programmatic, how free from the whiff of the scholar's midnight oil are the topographical and mythological elements in MacLean's work. The same impulse seems to have informed his reading of Robert Harrison, a late 15th century Scottish poet, a schoolmaster of Dunfermline. Heaney's 2009 translation of Harrison's The Testament of Cresside was a fine culmination of his infatuation with the Scottish matter, and it impelled the Irish poet to provide some interesting comments. In his conversation with Dennis O'Driscoll, Heaney pointed to a hidden Scotland at the back of my ear. The Ulster Scots idiom I used to hear from country antrim farmers at the cattle fairs in Ballymena. Almost the same words are used in the introduction to the Testament of Cresside and Seven Fables. Heaney says, Harrison's language led me back into what might be called the hidden Scotland at the back of my own ear. The speech I grew up with in mid-Ulster carried more than a trace of Scottish vocabulary, and as a youngster I was familiar with Ulster Scots idioms and pronunciations across the River Bann in County Antrim. I was therefore entirely at home with Harrison's sound of sense, so much in tune with his note and his pace and his speech that I developed a strong inclination to him along with the time. Much later, the Irish poet came across a British Library exhibition which included an illustrated manuscript of one of Harrison's fables. So he says again, I was so taken by the jaunty, canty note of its opening lines that I felt an urge to get it into my own words. It is at this point that Heaney provides us with the already quoted suggestion of the fable's language, giving him a sense of this hidden Scotland, a trace of the repressed linguistic and topographical identity. The Irish variant of this issue is memorably explored in the poems of Wintering Out. Emphasized by the poet in his introduction to the Harrison translation is his memory of a sudden discovery of intimacy with a language whose accents, intonations, and even words sounded strangely familiar to him. He says, the way his voice is, as he might have put it, mingled with the verse form, the way it can modulate from insinuation to instruction, from high-toned earnestness to wily familiarity. And it was this sensation of intimacy with the speaker at once sober and playful that inspired me to begin putting the not very difficult Scots language of his originals into rhymed stanzas of more immediately accessible English. So, if we go back to what HEANEY wrote about his sense of place in his first volume of essays, Preoccupations, which I quoted at the very beginning, we should pay attention to both what he observes of poets such as Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes, and Geoffrey Hill, who can master their own part of the English landscape and create different Englands of the mind, and to his precise technique of mingling a traditional idea of geography to the oral and oral heritage of a place. In this way, McCaig's, Maclean's and McDermott's Scottishness, like HEANEY's Irishness or David Jones' Welshness, is something quite different from a pure idea of a local cultural identity. What HEANEY had at the back of his ear was not only the country Derry dialect, the Ulster Scots idiom he heard in County Antrim, and the language of the Irish poem which he translated as Sweeney Astray in 1983, but also the Gaelic Highlands at the oral Scots culture. The Old English as registered in the epic poem Beowulf, the English patrimony of linguistic imposition he could read in Wordsworth, Hopkins and Hardy, the American accents of Elizabeth Bishop, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost and Robert Lowell, as well as the estrangement suffered by the English language when possessed by poets such as Joseph Brodsky, Ian Crichton Smith and Solly MacLean, or by wonderful translators whose works were well known to HEANEY. And I'm talking about John Sinclair and Charles Singleton when they worked on Dante Alighieri's comedy. So, in short, if you are a reader wanting to get this kind of music at the back of HEANEY's ear, it is advisable that, as McCaig said in one of his poems referring to McDermott, you should observe 2 minutes pandemonium.
Obrigado pela vossa atenção. Eu queria aproveitar para agradecer ao professor Marco Fazzini esta belíssima conferência sobre a SEAMUS HEANEY e a poesia escocesa. E espero que todos tenham seguido bem com a legendagem que tiveram no ecrã, tendo sido vista por nós como a melhor solução. Agradeço a todos, agradeço ao conferencista. Não temos na sala neste momento, já não temos neste momento nenhum público, exceto os funcionários da Biblioteca Eduardo Lourenço, e eu vou ter que, não tendo chegado também nenhuma pergunta por escrito, encerrar esta conferência agora agradecendo ao nosso convidado de hoje este trabalho que nos apresentou aqui com este tema relevantíssimo também para esta biblioteca, tendo em conta não só o público da poesia, mas também aquela obra, aquela parte importantíssima da obra do patrono desta biblioteca, que na verdade se destaca pelas suas reflexões sobre a poesia e sobre os poetas. Marco Fazzini, it's a great pleasure for us to have you joined in this library Eduardo Lourenço in Guarda, for this conference in this cycle of writers, essayists, and artists about European literature. We have no public in this moment in the library, so we want to say that it's a good news for us to have a writer and a researcher from Italy in this cycle, and we are grateful to you with your work in this day. It's an important day for this library. Thank you very much. And if you want to say something to us.
Thank you. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yes, please. I would like to thank you for the organization, l'assessor e la Biblioteca de Guarda for this invitation, special invitation. I hope you can hear me because sometimes the line is coming and going, but it was a real pleasure to take part in this meeting, which is one of a series of meetings with academics and researchers and writers. And I would like to thank the translators for my speech, because I assume that it was not easy to translate all those links and names and syntactical constructions, which sometimes can be quite strange for a talk. So it was a great job from your part, really. And it was a pleasure to have my work translated into Portuguese, because this is quite a new field of research for me. Because as you can realize, I moved from Ireland to Scotland to South Africa, trying to reconnect all the links Seamus Heaney had when he was a young writer. So that was a big job from my part, but also a great pleasure to have contributed to this special section of Seamus Heaney intellectual life, which was rich in as far as international links are concerned. And I hope that this can help your candidatura for European capital of culture, because we live and we survive through these international links. So a festival or gathering or a series of lectures might really be useful for the enlargement of our knowledge and our European citizenship. So all the best for your work, and I hope we can meet soon again. These are strange times under the COVID. So I really hope we can meet again in the Biblioteca de Guarda and stay all together. And thanks again.
Thanks, Marco. We will be together soon, I think. Thank you very much. I must make a small traduction of your words in Portuguese. Thank you very much. O Marco Fazzini, posso com alguma dificuldade resumir as palavras dele nesta intervenção final, dirigindo-se primeiro, ele também compreende um pouco português, referindo-se primeiro às dificuldades que ele imagina que tenha havido, e houve com toda a certeza, nós sabemos, da parte da pessoa que fez a tradução, referindo-se a questões intrinsecamente da área da linguística, mas também da cultura, das referências que fez e aos autores citados, alguns dos que foram amigos do poeta aqui no tema central da conferência. É evidente que o Marco falou de outras coisas e refere-se à Guarda, à cidade da Guarda e a alguns amigos que ele já tem cá e, sobretudo, aos trabalhos que estão a ser desenvolvidos pela biblioteca, por um lado, que ele muito aprecia, desejando a todos sucesso nas tarefas de responsabilidade que têm aqui na biblioteca e, em particular, também ao projeto de candidatura da cidade da Guarda, capital europeia da cultura. Portanto, ele deseja também que haja sucesso e que, dentro de pouco tempo, possamos encontrar-nos de novo e ele possa também voltar a Portugal e visitar esta cidade. Thank you.
Grazie, grazie. Muito
Grazie,
obrigado.
Marco. Obrigado.
Grazie.
Uma boa noite.